Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled, If You Label It, They Will Come. I'm Courtney Young, an attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenter, Kasey Adams, thank you for joining us. Kasey is a member of the Drug and Device Litigation and Product Liability Litigation groups at the law firm of Butler Snow in Ridgeland, Mississippi. Ms. Adams specializes in drug and device litigation, product liability litigation, and pharmaceutical, medical device, and healthcare. With that, I am pleased to turn things over to Kasey, who will begin today's presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate Medmarc for having me and appreciate all of you for joining for this webinar today. Hopefully, someone out there appreciates my sense of humor and the movie Field of Dreams and understands my title reference. But in my experience, it's also really true, because it seems like no matter how careful we are or how closely we follow the rules, no matter what we do, lawsuits still come, right? And so to start, I think we all have to acknowledge that no prescription drug or medical device is perfectly safe. I mean, that's impossible. And I think we all also know that it's impossible and, frankly, unhelpful to warn of every single possible or foreseeable risk that a drug, device, or biologic could have. But the good news is that there are some strategies and other considerations to think about that can help us both proactively prevent labeling claims, but also help us to defend them more efficiently and effectively. So we're going to spend some time today talking about some of these practical things we can do. But first, to just set the stage for where we're going today, I think it's important that we all have at least a preliminary understanding of the types of product liability claims we're most likely to face in this industry. I have first here the basic negligence claim. This is ultimately what the others revolve around, but we see it in a variety of forms. Design defect, this is one we see a lot, and it's a claim that there was some kind of foreseeable risk posed by the product when it was manufactured and when it's used for its intended purpose. You'll sometimes hear this described as someone putting a product on the market that's inherently dangerous or useless. That's some of the language we see. This is different from a manufacturing defect, because a manufacturing defect is going to be alleged when the defect that is being alleged is actually from the manufacturing process itself. So we see this more when there's a recall of a certain batch of a product, for instance, or something broke down in quality control or something like that. We also have strict liability. These are the kinds of cases where you can be held liable even if you are not negligent. This is usually coupled with design defect claims, particularly in terms of pharmaceuticals and medical devices, and the specific state law at issue is going to play a big role there. But probably the most common one we see, and what we're focusing on in today's webinar, is the ever-ominous failure to warn claim. So just generally, what is a failure to warn? I will say with a caveat that state law does differ in terms of the specifics of failure to warn claims, but the definition that you see on the slide is kind of the most basic overarching premise that you will see in failure to warn claims that seems to stretch across the jurisdictions. So what the plaintiff is going to have to do when they're bringing a failure to warn claim is show that you failed to adequately warn of the risks of a product and that your failure to do so is what actually caused his or her injury. And there are four main prongs to the way that we look at this. First is the idea of general causation, and this is the plaintiff being able to say, this drug, device, biologic, whatever it is we're talking about, this is capable of causing the injury alleged just generally. The plaintiff is also going to have to prove the specific causation. This means they have to show that the drug or device we're talking about that's specifically at issue in that case actually caused the injury to that specific plaintiff. So here you're going to see the individual's exposure to the product or the device being taken into account. They're also going to want to consider other risk factors, other potential causes for the alleged injury, and all of that is going to fall into place there. In terms of the warning itself, plaintiff is going to have to show that you failed to act reasonably in your warning, and that's what I say as adequacy. It's about the reasonableness of the warning. And I understand that this is a very loaded way of putting this, but that's ultimately what it's going to come down to is, was the warning that we put on the product adequate to warn consumers that this injury could happen to them? Timing is going to be really important in terms of this adequacy component, and we're going to spend some time talking later about proper documentation and being aware of red flags and other warnings. This is important because your reasonableness in determining whether or not to include a warning is going to come down to what you knew or should have known and when and how you actually acted on that knowledge. So did you update the label at that time or include additional warnings or send out a letter? So that's all going to be taken account in looking at your reasonableness and whether that warning was adequate. Proximate causation, that is saying that the plaintiff has to prove that this defective or inadequate warning we talked about is responsible for the injury. So a lot of times we see this come out through testimony of, plaintiffs saying, had I been warned of this risk, had I known that it could cause this injury, I would not have taken the drug. But those are the main concepts and prongs that the plaintiff is going to be seeking to show in these claims. One important concept to keep in mind here that I want to spend just a few minutes on is the idea of where the duty to warn is actually going to lie. So we call this the learned intermediary doctrine. I don't want to get too in the weeds of the law here, but in the context of this industry of prescription drugs, devices, biologics, this doctrine can really be critical in protecting your company. So it is really important to know the law of the state at issue when it comes to this concept. It does apply in most states, but certainly work with your legal counsel, depend on them to understand how this could potentially apply if you are faced with a failure to warn lawsuit. Because what this essentially says is the company's duty to warn is going to run to the physician, to the prescriber of the drug or medical device, not to the patient itself. There is a caveat here that I want to mention because this can be applied differently where you're engaging in marketing directly to consumers. So be aware of that, but either way, this is just a really important concept to know. And for the states that do apply this doctrine, the critical decision point is going to be whether the physician's decision to prescribe the drug or implant the device or recommend that certain treatment, it's going to hinge on whether or not that physician's decision would have been impacted or changed by a different or additional warning. So this can really be important in terms of defending claims where someone's alleging you failed to warn them of a risk. So really just be aware of this concept. In actual litigation, some of the best testimony we get in cases in terms of this is where a prescriber says, hey, even if this additional warning label or a new warning or some kind of additional language would have been on the label, I still would have recommended this treatment option to the patient. And that's really huge. That's a really, really helpful thing to be able to point to in defense of a lawsuit. Now, of course, you can have situations where this will cut the opposite way, but generally that's the kind of testimony we get, which is really helpful. So just an important doctrine to be aware of as you kind of think about labeling claims and how it might affect your business. The concept of innovator liability is even more in the weeds than learned intermediary doctrine, and it's not as clear-cut. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this at all, but I did just want to raise it and highlight it for you because it's a really important concept to just be aware of and stay current on. Just a few months ago, actually in December of 2017, the California Supreme Court became the first state Supreme Court to recognize this concept. So right now it's unclear how many more will follow, but what this says is that a manufacturer of a brand name prescription drug and presumably device can be held liable for a failure to warn claim, even if the plaintiff who's bringing the lawsuit actually took a generic version of that drug. And so I just want to stop and think about that for a moment, because if you manufacture a brand name product, this court in this holding is saying you can be held liable even if the patient did not use your product. And I know that seems really counterintuitive, or at least it does to me, but the court's focus in the opinion ultimately came down to the fact that in terms of labeling, a generic drug label has to be the same as the label for a brand name drug. So whether you are a generic manufacturer or a brand name manufacturer, this case and just being aware of it and seeing if other states follow could really have a huge impact on potential liability or a potential defense to liability. This has been a big topic of conversation over the last few months, and I imagine we're going to see more of this issue in 2018, so just be on the lookout and stay informed. Now that we've gotten through some of the boring technical law stuff, I want to talk about some practical things to be aware of and different precautions that we can take. So in your just day-to-day working world in this industry, I think there are a few things in particular that we all need to be keenly aware of. There are just certain trends and triggers that can really just be early signals for us that upcoming litigation might be on the horizon. And it can also signal to us that certain precautions or preparations or investigations need to start taking place. And caveat, this is not an exhaustive list at all, but these are just some of the bigger warning signs that we see that I thought it would be helpful to talk through. One big red flag is an FDA warning letter. Depending on the circumstances of the warning, this can be a huge trigger if you do receive a warning letter about your product that litigation may be heading your way soon. So be aware of that. And even though we all know that the labeling and regulatory process is, and frankly is intended to be, an ongoing process, I have label change here because making a label change or submitting a CBE can also be a trigger. In my experience, plaintiffs love to point to a label change that we made to say, look, you knew this was an issue, but you waited X years after my client used the product to finally warn people of this risk. So even though it's intended to be an ongoing process where we update it as we receive more information, plaintiffs tend to use that in litigation. So just be aware of that when you are making labeling changes, that could potentially signal to you future litigation. Also within that, also it was important to point out a competitor's label change here. If a competitor product that is similar to yours or has kind of the same risk profile as yours changes their label to update it with a certain adverse event or a warning, that's something that you need to be aware of and prepared to deal with because you will see that again. Another aspect that falls into this is foreign regulatory events. So, for example, if you have a product that is being marketed in Europe and in the United States, if the European Medicines Agency asks for a change to the label that has not been made in the U.S., this could and should be a big trigger to you that this is something that could be used in potential litigation down the pipeline. So be aware of these things, keep them in mind as they could be potential warning signals that it's coming. Literature is another huge component. It is really critical to have someone on your team staying updated on the latest literature, the latest medical journals, not only regarding your product, but also competitor products, adverse events that are relevant. If you see a big spike in literature that is discussing your product or a specific adverse event, this really needs to get the wheels turning. Same thing with news reports. Pay attention to what media outlets are saying. If you're not already, this is really important in identifying some potential warning signs of upcoming litigation. Also, if an individual or some kind of group files a citizen's petition about your product or its labeling, there's also a good chance there that litigation may be coming at some point. Now, admittedly, citizens' petitions can actually prove to be helpful in terms of defending a lawsuit later on down the road if you get to that point, but it should still serve as an early warning sign to be aware of. Investigations and complaints, these are important, that should set off a red flag for you. If you see some kind of spike or trend in event reports, adverse study results, or if someone from FDA or another agency starts an investigation, this should give you a sense of that, again, litigation may be forthcoming. And then, of course, everyone's favorite, the quintessential advertisement for a lawsuit. We all know it, that, if you took X product and have been injured, call 1-800. But the second you see not just your product, but a competitor product or even a product in the same realm or field as part of lawyer advertisements, this should definitely be a huge warning sign to get ready. And this doesn't just end at the advertisements you would see on TV or hear on the radio. Also be aware of internet blogs and advocacy support groups. We're starting to see this trend a lot more, where blogs or some type of website portal are being used to raise awareness for certain claims and get a lot of people on board without directly advertising a lawsuit. So be aware of that and keep that in mind as well. But like I said at the beginning, this is not just the only triggers to be aware of. You know your specific product, you know the specific field in which you compete. So you may be aware of other triggers that may be specific to your field. But these are just examples that at least should serve as a starting point for you to just start thinking about, that can raise some red flags and get you to start thinking about next steps of whether or not a labeling claim is coming your way if you start seeing some of this. So let's say we start seeing some of these warning signs. We're seeing a trend in the literature or any of these other early warning signals. What should be your next step? So first and foremost, depending on what your trigger is, be aware that you may need to issue a litigation hold. If you're on notice that a legal claim is coming, doing this early and with proper documentation is key to saving yourself a lot of trouble down the road. So work with your legal counsel, know when and how to do this, but this could be absolutely critical. So I have that first here because if indeed you are on notice of a claim, that has to be the first step. But it's also a good idea, once you start seeing some of these trends or these early warning signs, go ahead and get your legal counsel involved so they can start interviewing some of the key personnel. This may include people from medical affairs, from drug safety, regulatory folks, people in the marketing department. This will, of course, depend on the size of your company. There may be one person who handles multiple of these aspects. You may have multiple teams. But the important thing is to allow your legal team to start figuring out who the key players are for whatever product or adverse event you're seeing these warning signs for. That way, they're going to be able to better position you for a stronger defense down the road. Another idea is to take a look at competitors' labels during this time. I know I've mentioned competitor labels several times, but I think it's something that's easy to forget about. But it's important to know the kinds of warnings and the language that your competitors have in their labels, how they differ from the warnings in your label, anything that may end up being relevant or need to be dealt with. You want to just assess this very early on to give you a better outline of how you should defend whatever this claim is. Also, take some time. Again, all this is working with your legal counsel, but want to have a general review of core regulatory documents. Look back at the correspondence with the FDA, specifically with respect to whatever adverse event is likely to be the target of litigation based on the warning signs. because that's going to be really important to get a sense of what that back and forth was. I'd also start, at least in a preliminary sense, having an idea of what these plaintiff advertisements are, just to have a better idea of what you're going to be dealing with. And I should have bolded and starred this next one on the slide because it is so important, but I cannot emphasize it enough to document any decision-making on potential safety issues. The second it becomes an issue, particularly with respect to correspondence with the FDA. And we'll talk a little bit more about documentation in a little bit, but wanted to flag it here as something to be thinking about very early on. You may also consider collaborating with someone who's an expert in a particular adverse event or a side effect at issue when you're starting this process of assessing risk. This is another thing to just be aware of, raise with your legal counsel so that you can figure out when it's going to be best, if and when someone should be consulted, but just something to keep in mind. Another one I should have bolded and starred on here is communications. It is critical to be very careful with communications when you start seeing these early warning signs and signals. Every single communication really needs to be drafted with this mindfulness of these warning signs or of this potential litigation. Choose language carefully, and also keep in mind that if you manufacture more than one product, more than one drug, device, or biologic, just a tip to make life easier, to the extent possible, try to discuss different products in different emails, because that will make things easier if you do find yourself in the unfortunate situation of being involved in litigation. I do not want to spend too much time talking about this slide either, but I did want to highlight some of the major things that we want to be thinking about in terms of legal defenses. Statute of limitations, this is something for your lawyer to worry about, but I want to highlight it because especially when you've had a product on the market for a while, this can be a really useful defense to just have in the back of your mind and have in your back pocket. It's a very fact-specific inquiry, and it's really going to come down to not only when the plaintiff used the product, but when the plaintiff may have been aware that they have some sort of claim, but it's still good to know about and just be aware that that could be a strong defense to a claim. Same thing with preemption here. It's definitely a more of a legalistic discussion, but I still wanted to mention it because we get questions from clients a lot wanting to know how they can be sued over the labeling of a product when the exact labeling at issue was approved by the FDA. And it kind of sounds crazy when we stop and think about it, right? I mean, the common sense thought would be, okay, if this label was approved by the FDA, who's the expert regulatory authority regulating these products, then why is it not adequate to a jury or in the legal system? And so, and that makes sense. It's a weird thing to think about. And there are some very specific instances where claims will be preempted because of FDA approval, but based on the current state of law as it is right now, it requires clear evidence that the FDA would have rejected a manufacturer's label revision before we can claim that the labeling lawsuit should not survive. But again, it's just something to have in the back of your mind and kind of hopefully have a better understanding of why these claims can proceed even if the FDA has approved the label. But what we're faced with most in these cases when it comes to actually defending them is being able to argue that there is no claim because there was no failure to warn here. And we say that by showing, look, the label was adequate. We were reasonable, like we were talking about before. We were reasonable in how we make ideas about which warnings we're going to include or information like that. So the 4 words I have here, just to help kind of trigger how we think about this in terms of how to show there was no failure to warn are available, accessible, accurate, and accepted. So as we're going through the regulatory process and we're keeping our label up to date, we're making revisions and updates based on the state of science as necessary, we want to be talking about these things that can help us prove this defense in a lawsuit later if necessary. So first, we want to be able to say the appropriate risk information was in the product label when the drug or device or whatever product it is we're talking about was given to the plaintiff. So available, the appropriate risk information was available. So that's one main thing we want to make sure to include is being able to point to and say the risk was available. Not only do we want it to be available, but we also want to make sure it was accessible to anyone reading the label, that we aren't just trying to hide these risks within pages and pages of data. We want to make sure that the important information, the serious risk based on the state of knowledge at the time is not only available, but also accessible. And then, of course, we want to show that the information in the label was also accurate. And by accurate, we want to show that the information in the label was consistent with the state of the science and our knowledge and beliefs at the time, and that our knowledge and beliefs at the time were obtained through clinical studies and appropriate testing. And this all goes back into the idea of reasonableness. We want to be able to show that the label language as we had it was reasonable at the time based on the state of science. So that goes into this accurate concept. And I use the term accepted here as well. Another important consideration is what the medical community knows. In a lot of ways, this loops back to the learned intermediary doctrine from earlier, but it is helpful to be able to show, particularly in terms of specific claims plaintiffs are bringing about the label language, that the medical community in general and the prescribing physician specifically was generally aware of any risk a plaintiff is bringing in this lawsuit. Or if they were not, we want to be able to say they were not aware because it was not a known risk. It was not an actual risk based on the studies and data and the state of science available. So these four prongs, the concepts, available, accessible, accurate, accepted, is just the way I think about when we're looking at potential pending litigation, what am I going to have to be able to show to say there was no failure to warn here? Now, of course, this is easier said than done, but I think if we start thinking about these things very early on, when we first see these warning signs, these early signals, it will help to guide our thinking because we know what kind of information we're going to be looking for. We know what kind of questions that we are going to ask. And if you do find yourself in a labeling claim, not only do we want to be thinking about these potential defenses and ways we're going to guard against the claim, but we also want to be thinking about the different angles that plaintiffs may take to prove against that defense and what plaintiffs are going to try to show to say that our label was not adequate. Obviously, there's a lot of different types of evidence we see. What I've included on the slide is what I've seen as some of the latest trends and kind of the main prongs of evidence that we see most often in these types of lawsuits. So first, we always see bad, and I'm putting bad in air quotes here, but we always see the bad company documents used in these lawsuits. Every company document, any email, any correspondence related to the product at issue or to the side effect that is being raised in the lawsuit, all of these documents are going to be combed through for any ammunition to show that you acknowledge an unlabeled risk and dismissed it, or to show the key date whenever the plaintiff is going to say you had knowledge of the need to warn consumers about this risk. things like that are going to be combed through company documents to try to put together this company story that the plaintiff is going to want to weave. One of the favorite tactics that I've seen is to point to certain individuals within the company. The favorite always tends to be someone in marketing. They try to pull from some company document that may be taken out of context, and oftentimes is, in our opinion, but that they can point to say, look, here's someone in marketing trying to mitigate or underestimate some kind of risk. And this is often used to espouse this profits over patient safety theme. And we see that a lot coming out through company documents and through the story that plaintiffs are going to try to tell if a labeling claim gets to a lawsuit. So it's really important to understand your company story, know it, acknowledge it, identify from the beginning. Once you're aware of these warning signals, be aware of what kind of documents or correspondence can be used as bad documents to a plaintiff to try to prove this claim, even if it seems like a mischaracterization, because the earlier you're aware of it, the earlier you can help shape the company story and put things in context. But to be able to put these company documents in context, we have to be aware of what's out there. And so that's the type of evidence we see from plaintiffs a lot. Another one is the regulatory story. This is really going to be key as well, particularly if there was any kind of corrective or critical action taken by regulators. Another thing that we see a lot in terms of the regulatory story is if the FDA is requesting more information from a company with respect to a certain product or a specific trend or a specific signal or side effect. So it's important to not only know and understand your company story generally, but also to have a good sense of the regulatory story. The key thing here is really understanding and being able to explain why certain decisions were made, why a certain language was not included in the label, why a certain warning was included in one section of the label but not another. So it's really important to fully understand the picture of the regulatory story, the key players in the regulatory story, because that's evidence that we see plaintiffs using a lot to try to prove their claim, to try to say that the label was not adequate. Just like it's important to be aware of the literature and medical journals to trigger you as an early warning sign, it's also important to be aware of, acknowledge, study the literature in medical journals that plaintiffs will say is bad literature for us, or helps prove their case. There are often ways to attack the adequacy of these studies or acknowledge the biases in them, and the case reports that plaintiffs will use to make their case. But again, to be able to defend against it, we have to know what that evidence is. So be aware of that. And of course, competitor labeling, I know I mentioned this several times, but I really think it's important to be aware of, because we are seeing plaintiffs in warning and labeling cases use competitor labeling and foreign labeling that differs from your own in an attempt to prove their case. So if this is an issue in your case where a competitor label or a label on your product used in another country differs from your U.S. label, identify that very early on, because you will likely see this being used by plaintiffs if a labeling claim or a warning claim actually makes it to a lawsuit. And this brings me to my last big kind of prong of talking points that I want to spend some time on, because when we think about the types of evidence that a plaintiff is going to use to try to prove that your label is not adequate, we also need to be thinking about some of the best practices we need to be trying to employ. We need to try to communicate to our companies of what we can do to help mitigate our risk of even getting to that point. So I want to discuss a few of the key ones. I have a couple here that I want to talk through in a little bit more detail, but again, I will say this is in no way an exhaustive list. The key thing is going to be just being vigilant in your practice, in your specific field or type of product you work in, and really staying up to date on trends and resources because that will make the ultimate difference. But I have a few here to kind of help start thinking through some of these things and hopefully spark you to think about things specific to your company that would also be a good best practice to implement. Now, I have follow policy here. I know this is self-explanatory, but communicating to your teams the importance of this and just setting the standard from the very beginning that other behavior will not be tolerated helps to set those clear expectations from very early on. And when I say follow policy, this is not just about specific written policies or guidelines, but I also mean just having clear lines of communication, particularly about who has certain responsibilities. It should be very clearly communicated to your team that decision makers or people who are experts in an area should be the one drawing conclusions about that area. And the penultimate example that you'll see is someone in marketing making a comment about a safety issue. So we want to be very clear with our teams, with the people we're working with from the beginning, that there needs to be a clear delineation of that policy and who is responsible for certain tasks. Now, you may be wondering why call notes is on here. I added this because this is something that's coming up more and more a lot lately. So I want to mention it in case it applies to anyone on the webinar today, but it may be very specific to your practice area and the kinds of sales and marketing techniques that you employ. But if in your business you do use any kind of sales reps or you have individuals calling on doctors or making visits to hospitals or physicians' offices to market your product or to speak to someone about your drug or device or biologic that you're offering, I think it's important to just keep a few things in mind about call notes on these visits. The best advice, based on some of the trends we're seeing in litigation of this type, is to really have just kind of a generic blanket call note that really does nothing more than acknowledge a visit to the facility took place. If your sales reps or the people on your team that are actually visiting doctors or hospitals, if they're keeping detailed notes of visits or detailed observations of the impressions they have, of doctors they spoke with or different people in the industry they meet with, or if they are emailing or texting physicians or clinics or potential customers, this can and will be used against you if you end up in a warnings lawsuit. So, have open conversations with your team about this and really, in coordination with your legal counsel, determine what the best process for this will be for your specific needs. But we are seeing call notes being used a lot more in these labeling claims, specifically with certain side effects and risks. And so just something to keep in mind of and try to develop a practice that both works with your business model, but is also consistent with just keeping all of these early warning signals and best practices in mind. I have communication practices here as well, and we started talking a little bit about this earlier, but I cannot stress enough how important it is to be mindful of communication, and really think of everything with the mindset that anything you say can and will be used against you. If you approach situations, if you approach emails with this mindset, and you'll likely be better off. This includes really being mindful about the key selling messages that we're communicating to our sales teams, not just in terms of PowerPoint presentations or actual written materials, but also just what we're communicating verbally. We really need to be mindful and be cautious and really try to employ best practices. And as we talk about best practices, I'm only going to say this once because I think that's all that's needed, but just for yourselves to communicate to your teams, be mindful, never, ever, ever forget that emails never die, ever. We have to be mindful in our communication practices because any word, any sentence, any phrase in emails that may be taken out of context will be taken out of context if we get involved in litigation. I'm sure you can easily find online by a quick Google search examples of things like this where comments made or offhand statements in emails come back to haunt people in any industry. And so it's just so important that we really keep this in mind. Think about the forms of communication we're using for certain needs, depending on what it is that you're trying to communicate about. If you're tossing around ideas or it's something that doesn't require documentation, consider picking up the phone, consider alternative forms of communication, and just habits and practices that will best position you to deal with some of these issues. Another just thing to think about when you are sending emails or your team members are conversing in writing, it's important to always avoid getting personal or emotional and stick to the facts here, because when you are communicating in writing, it's really important for us to avoid hyperbole, avoid writing about speculation or buzz, particularly about our products. So just make sure that we are implementing best practices of sticking to the facts, having these good communication practices, and of course this proper documentation. Definitely last but certainly not least on this slide, because I cannot stress enough how important it is to maintain proper documentation of any trends, any signals, any communication whatsoever with the FDA. Hindsight is always 20/20, but it's also really, really hard, particularly in labeling and failure to warn lawsuits. It's so hard to go back in time and try to retroactively characterize or understand what the FDA's position was on a certain issue or a risk factor at different points in time based on the regulatory correspondence. We know that there's a lot of informal communication back and forth that happens. A lot of times we're on a telephone call with someone from FDA or having some kind of in-person meeting or a conference. It's so critical that in those moments where there's that informal discussion or an in-person discussion where there's not written documentation, that we are contemporaneously documenting what these discussions are happening. And a best practice point there is to summarize the specifics, exactly what the positions were, what was discussed, why a certain decision was made, and then send that documentation in an email to FDA or to whoever your counterpart there is, just documenting that conversation happened. And then always make sure that when it does come to documentation, that you're being internally consistent and internally accurate. Now, like I said, I could talk all day about some of these issues and how they can come back to haunt us, but I truly believe that if we are all more intentional and more mindful in our thinking, how we approach things, how we communicate, how we document, then we're going to be in a much better position to not only proactively prevent claims by implementing best practices specific to the needs of our group, but also in reactively defending claims when they do unfortunately happen. So I really encourage you to take some of these just initial thoughts and ideas I've thrown out today and think about your specific practice, think about your company needs, work with your legal counsel to really figure out what some best practices will be for your group and what to communicate to your team and how that can really ultimately be a benefit. I know that I've thrown a ton of information at you in rather short order today, and I know we're getting closer to the top of the hour. So I do at this time want to open the floor up to any questions. If any has any, I'd be happy to try to answer if I can.
Great. We'll now begin the Q&A session. If you have a question, please feel free to submit it using the Q&A panel located at the bottom right of your screen. After typing your question in the space provided, hit the send button. Please make sure to direct your questions to all panelists in the Ask menu. And Kasey, we did have a couple that came in already, so here's the first one. You mentioned the importance of foreign regulatory decisions. Is that really information that can be used in a lawsuit filed in the U.S.?
Yes, it is. It's kind of hard to imagine that in a U.S. lawsuit that some kind of foreign decision could be at play, but it absolutely will be, just as a preliminary matter, because any information documenting those discussions and those decisions would be discoverable information to the plaintiff if they file a lawsuit. And so they're going to have that information. They'll be able to provide it to their experts who will use that knowledge of these foreign regulatory decisions to form opinions. And when it comes to trial, obviously your lawyer is going to try really hard to keep it out, but it's ultimately going to come down to the judge's decision about the rules of evidence and how that would apply in terms of it being relevant to these specific issues, or if it would be overly prejudicial. And so it, the actual use at trial may be up for debate, but they'll definitely be able to use it through the course of the litigation. So it's really important to keep in mind.
Good to know. Thank you. Next question. As a device company, how do we know where to draw the line between proper documentation practices and too much documentation?
Yeah, and that goes back to specifically, I'll say, with FDA, you can never have too much documentation in terms of keeping good written track of the regulatory correspondence and discussions back and forth that reflect what FDA's understanding is, because it is so hard to go back and recharacterize or try to pinpoint when certain things were discussed or when certain decisions were made. So there's never too much documentation in that respect. But in terms of other correspondence, there certainly can be, which plays into some of the best practices that I was mentioning with, who's actually making the decisions, who's actually qualified to make the decisions when it comes to the science side of things, and documenting things when the appropriately trained and staffed people are making those decisions and working in those areas.
Okay, it looks like that's all the questions we have. So thank you so much, Kasey. You gave a really great primer on a massive topic, and I know that we at Medmarc and our listeners really appreciate your insights.